Now I have the privilege of, introducing Dr. Vivek Agarwal, who is co-chairing the session on pediatric anxiety disorders with me. Dr. Agarwal is currently a professor and head of psychiatry department at King George Medical College, King George Medical University, Lucknow. He has been trained in psychiatry from the same institute. He worked in IBHAS, Delhi for some time before joining the present institute. He has been working in child and adolescent psychiatry unit for 20 years. His area of interest has been neurodevelopmental disorders, especially ADHD, stress-related disorders, and he is also a member of the Global Burden of Disease India Mental Health Disorders Expert Group. So, welcome, Professor Agarwal. Me and Dr. Agarwal will be co-chairing the session, which has Professor Shobha Srinath, and I take great pride in introducing her. She is my teacher, and I won't be exaggerating to say that she's a fairy godmother, really, of child and adolescent psychiatry or child and adolescent mental health in India. Whoever aspires to be a child and adolescent psychiatrist or child and adolescent mental health professional in India aspires to be at least have an iota of what Shobha taught us. And I was a student, and I always thought that, my God, if I could work even a fraction of how hard and compassionately she worked. She really doesn't require any introduction. She has recently retired as a senior professor from the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry from NIMHANS, Bangalore. Her major areas of clinical interest are developmental disorders, OCD, and mood disorders. And she has been the pillar of the department which she set up in NIMHANS, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and has been a member on many boards and advisory committee, and continues to advocate the cause of children. So welcome, Shobha, for joining us, and we are really privileged to have you here. The second speaker is Dr. Kandaswamy, Preeti Kandaswamy. She again worked in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in NIMHANS. After doing her MD, she is DM in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, which NIMHANS started, and she is one of the first postgraduates from the department. She then worked in JIPMER as an associate professor for 6 years, and now she's currently serving as a consultant at Neuro Foundation, Salem, which is her hometown from September 2020. And her areas of interest are pediatric anxiety disorders and early intervention for neurodevelopmental disorders. So welcome, Dr. Kand. Shobha will be speaking on phenomenology. So over to you, Shobha. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jairanjan Ram and Vivek. And thank you to ACAM. I wish the organization in India a very bright future. A lot of work can be done, and I'm sure will be done. So I'm happy and glad to be part of this first meeting. We are already at 7 o'clock, and I know this place, we're supposed to finish at 7:30. So let me see if I can finish it a little earlier so that we have a Saturday evening intact. So Jairanjan, you can tell me if things are not clear or...
No, it's absolutely clear.
Yeah. Fine. So I just thought I would do this. Would start here. Fear and anxiety are very natural phenomena. They serve a very, very useful purpose, completely normal and developmentally appropriate, save us from a lot of trouble and danger and warn us of many things. So, like a lot of symptoms in psychiatry, the problem occurs as to when to consider it pathological. And so you will find that a lot of the work and the underdiagnosis and not understanding it well is a consequence of the fact that it is considered normal. So when does it become pathological? How do we define severe, persisting, extensive avoidance, subjective distress, impairment is a cause for trouble and lots of times doesn't get asked. So in terms of the prevalence, it's one of the most prevalent conditions. And it ranges from anywhere, like you see. And in the clinic population, it is one of the most common that you will find in a child and adolescent psychiatry clinic, especially in a specialist place like NIMHANS. The gender difference is in favor of females. It's 1.5 to 2 times more in females. But sometimes it is said that in the clinics, more males come in. It's probably because it's a bias of referral, that males are not supposed to be feeling more anxious. Young children or boys have a particular importance in terms of gender and they are brought more often. But by and large, it is more common in females. And I just want to say to the young postgraduates here that this book is an ebook which is easily available and a very useful book to have on child and adolescent psychiatry. So in terms of age of onset, you will see that developmentally, it goes in phases. Separation anxiety, largely seen in preschool. Specific phobia can start in preschool and school age. And then you have social anxiety, generalized anxiety, panic, agoraphobia, and the like, with social anxiety going on into adolescence and young adulthood. So anxiety disorders become disorders when they fall beyond a certain limit. And if you look at the etiopathogenesis, one is aware that there is an interplay between stress and vulnerability. And adverse childhood experiences and anxiety are highly correlated. I would believe that anxiety is probably one of the earliest things that gets pathological in a number of disorders of childhood, even psychosis. So we are talking about anxiety, which is almost ubiquitous and might be a beginning symptom for a number of disorders. Of all the risk factors and of all the things studied, what has been found is that adverse childhood experiences, behavioral inhibition, insecure attachment render a greater risk for the development of anxiety disorders. In fact, of all the many studies done, behavioral inhibition is something that has been found to kind of breed true. And this behavioral inhibition, which is a temperamental characteristic, it is the reaction to novelty with apprehension. And this is seen in very young children, young babies. So this is something like something that can breed true or can later on in development turn into an anxiety disorder. So behavioral inhibition, insecure attachment is another, or a difficult attachment pattern is another issue that also poses a risk factor. And especially if you look at adverse childhood experiences, and if in the presence of adverse childhood experiences, there is the presence of a nurturant adult carer, then that has a protective influence. A lot of times, adverse childhood experience occurs in the absence of that buffer. And this business of attachment, which was originally thought to be largely of very young children, we now know that attachment relationships, they render protection well into adulthood. So the parent-child relationship is a very important protection from anxiety disorders. And we'll talk about that a little more. This is the study that Preeti Kandaswamy did many years ago. And this is another study from the north of India, and I think Vivek Agarwal would know about the study. And these were clinic-based study. this is largely in a tertiary center, and this is in a general medical center. And you can see that the division into these disorders are significant. One of the issues we have in anxiety is that you can lump it or you can split it. Lots of times, social anxiety kind of gets separated, but the other anxiety disorders tend to lump together. Separation anxiety disorder also occurs at much younger age groups. Though separation anxiety disorder doesn't have a DSM or an ICD, not separation, school refusal doesn't have a ICD or a DSM category, large amount of the school refusals come under the separation anxiety category. So this is the division of the cases which come to a clinic. As far as clinical features go, here is where the problem arises. So there are a small number of children who will clearly come with say, a specific phobia for an event or for an object or for an animal. But quite a number of children who present to a clinic may have any of these presentations. And these presentations naturally are not something that immediately makes a young person think about anxiety. So there is a great need in each of these presentations to look for anxiety disorders. In fact, routine screening of anxiety disorders must be indicated in all clinics, including pediatric clinics. Like a previous speaker said, it doesn't take long to ask a couple of questions which will bring about symptoms of anxiety. So there is a great need to ask about ACEs, and ACEs can be asked in almost any kind of setup. Other issues in anxiety disorders is that anxiety disorders rarely occur. I'm talking about the specific anxiety disorders like this. They rarely occur singly. There is usually other anxiety disorders associated with it. So if you have specific phobia, check for generalized anxiety disorder. Separation anxiety, check for other anxiety disorders. So other anxiety disorders often occur. And there's a dictum that if there is anxiety and severe anxiety, depression will not be far behind. So anxiety and depression have a tendency to co-occur. In fact, even when you look at studies, genetic studies done, and studies done in terms of parents who have anxiety disorders, do they have more children with anxiety disorders? It has been found that when anxiety disorders and depression together occur, then the chances of anxiety in children are higher. So it seems to run that anxiety and depression go together. So there's a great need to check for depression when you see severe anxiety. Of course, she also found that ADHD, ODD, specific learning disability also had co-occurring anxieties. So we just now said, this is a large percentage of children with anxiety disorder having a comorbid depressive disorder. And like I said, anxiety symptoms are a common occurrence along with many psychiatric diagnoses, especially depression. So one must not fail to ask here, and I will talk about ASD a little later. So when we're talking about clinical assessment, it's an internalizing symptom. And you know that this can be classified as internalizing and externalizing. And internalizing symptoms are not easily discernible for an outsider, like a parent or a teacher. And oftentimes children suffer from that inside. And like for all clinical assessment with children and adolescents, there is a need to ask multiple informants. And oftentimes, young people fail to interview the child alone. Very young children are capable of talking about their personal distress. The language that you may use, the way you may ask them may differ, but children can tell you what bothers them, what worries them, what upsets them, what troubles them. So there's a great need to interview the child alone. There's a need to look at precipitating and maintaining factors. And like was already earlier said, it is necessary to ask for family history of anxiety and depression. Because if you look at adult studies, genetic studies, 40% of the variants, I think it's even so in children, 30 to 40% can be explained by genetic factors. That is not to say that they breed true, but the presence of psychiatric illness, and all of us are aware that heritability need not be heritable by anxiety to anxiety. It might be psychopathology of any kind. And so one must look for family history of illness as well. Asking for ACEs, including bullying, when you're talking about adverse childhood experiences, is another factor that can be forgotten very easily. Comprehensive assessment for ADHD, ASD, and SLD is required. There are formal assessments. Some of these are open access, you don't have to pay. The most common instrument, and the one which Preeti Kandaswamy used, was CARED. Then pediatric anxiety rating scale is also something that can be used. So these are instruments that can be used. Now we come to children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And I'm talking about children with autism. Especially the low functioning children have great difficulty in articulating or discussing or explaining to families about the kind of troubles they have. And we already heard about that ASD with and without intellectual disability and self-harm and suicide. Now we are talking about children who have significant anxiety, unable to express, and the only way it is shown is by significant behavior problems. Very recently, I had a young family, a young boy with ASD, whose mother told me that the aggression increased exponentially at home. And because it was COVID times, they were unable to go to the hospital, and they were all injured because a child beat them up very often, many times in the week. It turns out that they had enrolled the child in an online, some computer program, which they thought their child was capable of doing. He showed an interest, of course, like a lot of ASD children, he showed an interest in computers and on the mobile. And they kind of put him into this, and they found retrospectively, after they stopped it because of his behavior problem, they found that his problems decreased significantly. And they found later on that he actually was very, very anxious in performing in these areas. So oftentimes, anxiety is not understood because in neurodevelopmental disorders, because neurodevelopmental disorders have a kind of way of overshadowing everything. That being ASD, being IDD means everything is explained. So there's a great need for young clinicians to spend time to understand this particular issue, which can explain a lot of the behavior problems that occur. I just want to touch on the stability of anxiety disorders. There is only moderate stability in pediatric anxiety for the particular disorder, like, for example, separation anxiety breeding true, or social or generalized anxieties breeding through. So there is limited homotypic continuity for specific disorders, but there is a substantial degree of continuity of psychopathology as indicated by the presence of other anxiety disorders. We have had any number of cases that I have seen in demands where the child has come in as separation anxiety disorder, and as the child grows older, there is OCD, social anxiety, and other disorders. The original anxiety disorder no longer is present. So there is a broader homotypic continuity. And of course, the presence of heterotypic continuity, like depression. So we know most adults with anxiety and mood disorders will have a childhood history of anxiety disorders, almost always. So the development of secondary depression seems to be particularly frequent and concerning heterotypic outcome. And the onset is more likely in individuals with a higher number of anxiety disorders, more severe impairment, and when panic attacks occur. This last point, I feel sometimes is not adequately recognized. That is, substance abuse and dependence disorders is a known heterotypic problem in people with anxiety disorders, sometimes used as a kind of a self-medication to start with, because they feel more in control of the situation. So there is a great need to look at this, and such being the case, the recognition and prevention of anxiety disorders at a younger age is the society stands to gain. So in terms of prevention, this is something that I found and I have read about it, and I think it seems to be replicated. So this is a website that you can look at. It's a school-based program, largely CBT-based, 6 to 10 weeks, and seems to have some effect on what can happen long-term. In addition, prevention of ACEs is something intuitively that we do understand, and there is enough literature. And this point that I would like to make about the importance of parent-child relationship into adolescence. So there is a great deal of talk about parent-child relationship in the young ages, but there is a great need to believe that just because they reach adolescence, it is normal for them to go and latch on to their peers. So something that happens often need not be normal. That is, just because so many youngsters go on and have a great peer relationship and stay away from their families doesn't make it normal. So there is more and more work to show that a parent-child relationship into adolescence makes a difference in the way the child can be socialized, the way the child can understand and be protected from a number of issues that can cause trouble. Yoga and its preventive abilities, its treatment abilities, work has been done. Still, a lot of work has to be done, but this is possible to be one of the areas which can help in increased help in coping. Now, of all the parameters that have been noticed in terms of risk for anxiety, it has been found that recurrent experience of being dyspneic, like an asthmatic child, the recurrent experience of becoming dyspneic makes the child prone to have anxiety disorders. So there are some things that have apparently stood the test of time, and this is one of them. There is a great need, therefore, to do some preventive work in groups of population where we know they are at high risk. There is a chapter on prevention, which is interesting and nice to read. I would like to just end with the next two slides. And I don't know how many of you have read about Michael Meany. His research was the first to establish a causal relationship between maternal care and behavioral epigenetic programming by cross-fostering pups. Showed how the corticotropic receptors in the brain and how the stress response of the mice pups as they grew older changed as a result of the grooming and licking and the care that the dam gave to the pups, and how a cross-fostering actually helped those at high risk to actually become low risk. So this is an interesting experiment, and that can be read. And I just wanted to talk about this particular person who won a Nobel Prize in economics. And what was his experiments? He demonstrated, in economics, he won it. He demonstrated vast savings produced by early intervention in the lives of children of poor and troubled families, and spoke about how they can be measured and what are the kinds of things you can give to families to see that they have high quality parenting and high quality care for these children from poor and deprived backgrounds. These are some additional viewing. I know these slides will be available, and so people can have a look at some of these references. I stop here. I'm trying to see whether we can finish on time. Thanks a lot for your patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shobha. Yeah.
I'll keep my presentation short. So I'll quickly run through the international guidelines on childhood anxiety. And then largely my presentation will be an Indian perspective. So I'll be sharing a study that we have done from NIMHANS. And then I'll be talking about what can be offered in a resource limited setting. Like already mentioned, that there's definite increase in the number of anxiety that we see in the clinic with the pandemic. And so I think it's important that we know what we can offer in a non-specialist setting. We know that for mild to moderate anxiety, CBT is the first line. And when we do consider medication, SSRIs are the first line. And the most preferred among the SSRIs are fluoxetine and sertraline. We also know from RCTs that combination therapy is superior to monotherapy, either SSRI or CBT alone. Quickly about the recent reviews on CBT and childhood anxiety. CBT definitely more effective than as compared to passive controls like no treatment or waitlist groups. There's a lot of interest in computerized CBT, especially so with the pandemic. And somehow computerized CBT seems to be a very good format to address the current need for accessibility. However, the recent reviews mention that they're not more effective than active controls, and therefore there seems to be more work that needs to be done in this area. We also do a lot of parental involvement when it comes to CBT in children, and this is another area where there needs to be more evidence. So overall, what reviews in CBT suggest is that there is a need for more research, especially in the low and middle income countries, comparing different formats of CBT, comparing CBT with other interventions, and also conduct research on special population like already mentioned CBT for children with autism. A quick review of the evidence for SSRI. Some of the concerns that we have regarding SSRI when it comes to children are the absolute risk for suicidal ideation, the risk for manic switch, and the behavioral activation. Behavioral activation is definitely much more common among children, younger children and those with anxiety disorder. However, I should mention that this should not be a factor to defer SSRI when indicated. A lot of times I see that adult psychiatrists are apprehensive about prescribing SSRIs for younger children. But when indicated, two important factors that guidelines recommend are, one is slow up titration, and the second is weekly monitoring in the first month. So these two factors can help in addressing some of these behavioral side effects. And therefore, I think it is important that we keep this in mind while prescribing SSRIs for children. I should definitely mention these two studies, the CAMS and the CAMELS. So short-term outcome definitely mentions that acute responders maintain improvement over the short term, and they're less likely to be chronically ill. However, long-term studies, as long as 4 years, mention that a significant proportion of them become symptomatic, remain symptomatic, or relapse, and therefore there is a need for us to address relapse prevention strategies. So I leave the evidence and guidelines here, and I'll move on to the study from NUMANS to give my own experiential account. And I think I'm here only for that. So this was a study of 60 children followed up over 6 months. The mean age of the children in this study was about 12.5 years, and the age of onset was nearly 9.71 years. You can see the difference between the age at onset and the time they really reached the services. The most common diagnosis in this population was social anxiety disorder. And like ma'am mentioned, a significant proportion of children had 2 or more anxiety disorders. 1/3 of this population had school refusal. So like ma'am mentioned, when you have a child with school refusal, always look for anxiety and depression. Significant proportion of these children had school-related stressors and chronic interpersonal difficulties related to school. And so liaising with the school became one important factor of intervention when we planned treatment. This was not a randomized control trial. We just did treatment as usual. And you can see the varied treatment that the children received. Some of the factors that I wanted to mention is, as part of the study, we offered one parent leaflet to the parents on some of the healthy parenting practices that they could do and help the child in supporting and overcoming the anxiety. And the other thing that we did was we had a small workbook, which was an 8-session workbook spread over 12 weeks, delivered over 12 weeks. And these were the 2 factors which were as an add-on to what they normally received. Quite a few children also received group intervention. The number was less though, but it was very interesting to engage children in group interventions. And it was interesting to see how they learned from each other during the group sessions. And some of their avoidant coping came through during the group sessions. It was interesting to see about how the other children helped their peers to overcome these avoidant coping. Liaising with school was an important element of the intervention, especially so when they had school refusal. So we often had to write a note to the school when we planned graded return to school and when we sought their support in helping the child overcome their anxiety. Quick mention about the parent leaflet. So some of the things that we mentioned on the parent leaflet was to encourage the child to talk about their anxiety and to face their fears and not to really foster avoidance. And then to help them generate their own solutions, because oftentimes we see one or both parents having parental anxiety, either primary or secondary to the child's issues, and they're very worried about the child's issues and Oftentimes, they do not allow the child to generate their own solutions. So this kind of helped in addressing their own anxiety and also to be as a co-therapist for the child in overcoming their anxiety. The other things we did mention was to employ gentle disciplining for these children, and then to practice relaxation with the child whenever they could. The pharmacotherapy I'm mentioning because you can see that we largely used SSRIs. Oftentimes you see that adult psychiatrists do SNRIs for adult population, but SNRI seems to have less evidence and data as compared to SSRIs when it comes to children and adolescents. And within the SSRI, you can see that the most preferred SSRI is fluoxetine. I'm now out of an institute and I continue to do the same what I did in an institute. And I do not really feel the need for an SSRI in a child, given that the tolerability is much more better for SSRI as compared to SNRI. A significant proportion received clonazepam as a short trial, but when prescribed, we always made it as a short trial for 2 to 4 weeks and made sure that it is tapered and stopped within that period. You can see that quite a few also received anti-ADHD. So this was a study which used a structured instrument to assess their comorbidities. And we found that a significant proportion had comorbid inattentive ADHD, which did not really come through in a clinical assessment. And this is something that we need to keep in mind when we see children with social anxiety, because often the inattentive ADHD goes missed. Overall, the six-month outcome was very favorable with a remission rate of 64%. Those adolescents who had a greater baseline severity, who had a subtype of social anxiety, and with comorbid depression and other anxiety, were the ones who had lesser remission rates. Although these children improved, the remission rates were relatively less in this population. This study also had a qualitative component. For me, the most interesting part was actually the qualitative component. So we took a written narrative at baseline and at 12 weeks. And then we tried and saw what really helped these children best. Because oftentimes we adapt interventions that are developed from high-income countries. And so I was always curious to understand if these interventions that is adapted from there, does it really work for our children? Surprisingly, a lot of children endorsed cognitive interventions. Not many really mention about the behavioral interventions. Rarely did they mention the medication, but quite a bit of children mentioned about the cognitive interventions as having helped them best. One of the challenges that I faced during the study was that it was very difficult to retain the children for the 8 sessions. After about 2 to 4 sessions, the dropout was significantly high. You can see in this graph that the anxiety significantly dropped within the first 12 weeks. So by the end of 2 months, the parents perceive significant improvement, do not really feel the need for further follow-up. And therefore, addressing relapse prevention was a serious challenge. And this is something that changed my approach to interventions after this. So I'll quickly move to what can we do in a resource-limited setting. In terms of assessment, I oftentimes feel that when in doubt, always to employ SCARE-C. When I started the study was started because I felt that I didn't really understand completely what about the anxiety disorder. Oftentimes, I ended up diagnosing anxiety disorder NOS because I was not really able to subtype these children into a specific group. And when I did the study, when you use a structured instrument, I saw that a significant proportion of children with social anxiety, the non-generalized subtype, often did not come through clinically as socially anxious and ended up receiving the anxiety NOS diagnosis. Now, this makes a huge difference in terms of prognosis and what interventions you offer. So I feel that it makes a difference when you employ a simple rating scale such as SCARE in a clinic. While you talk to the parent, you can usually give it to the child. And most school-going children take about 5 to 10 minutes to fill in this form. It also kind of helps them validate their own symptoms. It also helps them understand that these very many symptoms that they're going through is part of the same disorder. And sometimes I feel anxious children are more comfortable writing things down than talking with you. So in many ways, I think the rating scale helps to comprehensively assess the child. Oftentimes when adult psychiatrists refer to me, I see that they start the SSRI and then refer to me. We need to keep this approach in mind that it should be CBT plus or minus SSRI rather than SSRI plus or minus CBT. I think this was something that Dr. Sheikh had mentioned in the beginning. Based on the symptom severity and the level of engagement, I oftentimes start CBT right in the first session while the assessment is ongoing. When we do prescribe benzodiazepine, it should be a short trial, and make sure to prescribe a tapering schedule and stop it, because there are times when families may not come back to you. And so it's important that they have a tapering schedule and there is a clear prescription to stop the clonazepam. I also find it very useful to plan an early follow-up within the first 2 weeks. That gives you time to spend with the family, 1 for assessment and 2 for a session with the child. The workbook that we used had these components, which I've listed out on the right side of your screen. This workbook, for those who are interested, is available. I put it in the reference as a link. There is a lot of scope for improvement on this workbook, and people can feel free to adapt it. But you can see that most of the core cognitive interventions came in the later half of this workbook. And after the qualitative component, I feel that some of these have to be introduced early on. And so I kind of modify this during my clinical. The way I practice now is slightly different from what it is in the workbook. So what I think can be offered in a resource-limited setting is, 1, to helping the child monitor anxiety. School-age children quickly understand this, and they will be able to monitor the anxiety on a visual and log scale of 0 to 10. So you say that 0 is nil, 10 is max, and 5 is medium. And this is something that they quickly understand. It also becomes a method to converse about your subjective unit of distress over follow-up. I also help them recognize the early signs of anxiety, usually palpitation or breathlessness, and then to implement simple relaxation strategies such as slow and deep breathing. And I ask them to practice this every day for 10 minutes and also to do it whenever they feel and recognize early signs of anxiety. It also helps discussing with a young child about the mind-body relationship. You need to give examples of perceived threat. For example, if in a class, if a child says that there is a snake, and if everybody in the class gets anxious, what is the response that the child might have? And if then they realize that it was not a snake and it was only a rope, then what is the reaction of the body? So this is something that a school-age child will help and understand about the relationship between the mind and the body. In an older adolescent, I might talk about the thought, feeling, and behavior triad. I think it becomes easy for them to understand that. And I put this as the baseline in the first session and then call them for the next session for problem solving and more cognitive work. I also commonly come across many adolescents who land up with us during their board exams. So although they have had anxiety for a long time, it's only during significant academic pressure that they land up with you. So this is a time which is also important for the adolescent to perform, and they do not really have so much time for them to come back to you for many sessions. And therefore, I also talk about focusing on the efforts and rather defocus on the outcome, because there's a lot of focus on the outcome in our Indian population. Especially so, the parents and the teachers focus on the marks and the number of marks that they have to achieve, and therefore it builds in the performance anxiety in the child. So I ask the child as well as the family to keep their focus on the efforts or otherwise the process, and then to defocus on the outcome. I leave it here and we can see how we can take questions. I basically think that there is a need for interventional research. Now, whatever I mentioned now is not evidence-based, while the workbook is evidence-based, but the other half is not evidence-based. But I think we definitely need to have more cost and time-effective interventions, which we can employ in resource-limited setting, because oftentimes I find it very difficult to convince families to approach a clinical psychologist for sessions because they don't find it cost-effective. They have to pay out of their pocket, and they've already met a pediatrician or a neurologist before landing up with you. And therefore, oftentimes it is you who have to deliver these interventions within the resources that is available. And I think that we need to also plan intervention that can be delivered in group format for adolescents at school who may be at high risk for anxiety disorder, who may not really have the opportunity to reach your clinic. And I think it is also important to try out culturally relevant interventions such as yoga and mindfulness, which have to be tested. And we have to see about how we can put this across as a school-based program. And whatever comes out, this has to be open access, and we need to develop regional resource materials out of this, because I think it is essential that we have resource materials when we have to offer services to children. overall, I think we need to have a culture that is proactive in promoting mental health. I do not see even mental health professionals being very proactive about promoting their own mental health. And so I think creating a culture which is more proactive about promoting their own mental health and well-being is something that is very important for a country like us. I'll end it here. And I thank the organizing committee and I thank Dr. Shobha for getting me on board. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Preeti. Finishing well in time. I request all the participants to post their questions if they have any in the chat box. Meanwhile, Shobha ma'am has talked about the normal versus abnormal anxiety, their relationships with the adverse childhood experiences, especially, and other childhood psychosocial problems, and when to screen, especially as they do not present with anxiety as such, but different symptoms like school refusal. And then these disorders are highly comorbid with other anxiety disorders or neurodevelopmental disorders. And then careful assessment is required, keeping in mind the phenomenology as well as the comorbidities. And Madam also talked about the continuity, whether the anxiety disorders continue with the other anxiety disorders or different disorders like depression or substance use. And briefly, ma'am touched about the preventive aspects of the anxiety disorders. Let me see if there are any questions. And then Dr. Preeti Kandasamy talked about the management of pediatric anxiety disorders. She briefly gave the outlines, primarily CBT, and in medications the approved sertraline and fluoxetine. What precautions or the monitoring should be done when prescribing SSRIs to children and adolescents, especially the suicide and behavioral activations. Then advice to the parents, sharing literature with the parents. And she talked about her study on anxiety disorder children with favorable short-term outcome. And then in management, she talked about especially cognitive interventions have been found more effective and more acceptable to children, and what can be offered in resource limited settings. So I thank both the speakers for their wonderful talk. And I don't see any questions.
I can see something, Vivek. It says, can you point out to research about the impact of bullying in childhood on depression and anxiety, especially when bullying is about a child having a mother with alcohol use disorder?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know anything, Preeti can add, I don't know anything specific about the mother with AUD, but what bullying can do to a child who's already having anxiety, depression, what bullying can do to somebody who's vulnerable. There is no doubt at all about this, but I think it would have to be managed as a general disorder of being bullied and whatever happens. And there's a need for the child to be in therapy to talk about this. But I can't specifically talk about this as anything in research in this particular area. Preeti, would you have anything to say?
Nothing particular to add, ma'am.
Then whether screen, I don't know whether this is meant for this, whether this be allowed for any
previous session.
Yes, it's a previous session. But I think that just to say that Of course, a child with ASD can be allowed screen time. And
Ma'am, there is a question.
yes.
Do you think prevalence of a specific anxiety disorder may increase post-pandemic?
Okay. So what we have seen and people who have presented so far have shown us that they may not have come to the clinic, and once the clinics open, of course, they will increase the number and we may have an increased number of attendees. But it is clear that the kind of anxiety, the content of the anxiety during the pandemic would have been different because of what happened. You know, whether it was an OCD child who got worse, whether it was a mother and father's anxiety about whatever it was, got transmitted to the child. So the content of the anxiety that children and adolescents could have had would definitely have changed during the pandemic. The absolute numbers, of course, we think ought to be more, but time will tell us how it is. But in terms of what happens in the clinic, I often find that families talk elaborately about the screen time. And my worry is about the isolation the child is in a room alone with the internet and not being a part of the family group. And that, I think, is what, like our speaker previously said, there is nothing like ideal, but we can advise after checking out what is their current practice in parenting and whether there can be a movement towards more attachment, more joint family activity, more separate time, more downtime for each parent and for the children. So we might have to have some kind of an advice regarding that rather than an ideal. So I think a lot of time needs to be spent. And a take-home message for all the young people who are listening here is, when you do child and adolescent psychiatry work, you have to spend time with the child and the family. There is no one which way that you can get history just with talking to the father or talking to the mother. So there is a lot of investment of time. The more time you spend with them, greater is the rapport, greater is the chance for you to get an understanding of what's happening in the child's life in the family setting, in the pandemic setting, maybe. Yeah, I've just that to say.
Ma'am, there is another question. Can you please comment on when there is a significant parental psychopathology and its effect on children with anxiety disorders?
Yes, so parental psychopathology it's not just genetic. It's not the genetic, it passes on like that. It is mediated by their interpersonal relationship, the time they spend, the quality of time they spend, what they do about it, how do they parent, where's the attachment relationship. So of course, there is an impact. In fact, it is an adverse childhood experience for a child to have a parent who is mentally ill and not adequately cared, and the child is not adequately cared. All kinds of adverse childhood experiences can occur if the family is not mindful and if their parents don't have additional support. And it's in that one way that I wish to talk to a lot of adult psychiatrists and psychologists here, that if you have an adult who has a mental illness, never fail to ask about their children, about what they are doing, who's caring for them, who's playing the role of the parent at the moment. What does the child understand about the father's substance abuse? What is his understanding? Does the youngster want to come and have a word with the doctor to understand what has happened? You can prevent a lot of trouble for the young person in the house if the parent who is mentally ill is asked about the children at home and the child attended to. This is something I think will not take much time. Thank you. Preeti wants to add anything.
There is a question, has music therapy been meaningfully used in studies in these contexts?
Preeti wants to say something.
Music therapy, I'm not sure that we do talk about music therapy in autism. And I also read in the Cochrane review that if delivered by professionals, that it does have some evidence, but not really for anxiety. I've not come across. Somebody asked about anxiety in the COVID situation. I often see children, younger children, very young children, separated from the parents who have had COVID. Suddenly there's a sudden acute disruption in the attachment and the mother is off for a few weeks. So I've often seen that an acute onset of anxiety in the child. So that's something, and health-related anxiety, like after the COVID. So oftentimes the parents get into this health-related anxiety, and so that kind of feeds into the children. And so that is something that we used to see, and I hope that situations are getting better. So I'm hoping it will resolve.
There is another COVID-related question. given the huge burden of grief due to COVID on both parents and younger ones around, what are some general household practices that may be helpful? And she has given an example like living in US, I went into anticipatory grief therapy counseling, which has been very helpful to me, but such accesses may not be available. So Preeti would like to answer that.
Some of the protective factors, I feel like one is helping the child talk about their anxiety. I think oftentimes we don't allow children to talk about their anxiety and their worries. Somewhere I feel that one is about the screen time that everybody discuss about, but there is also this emotional disconnect. Oftentimes I see that the parents do not really understand what's happening in the emotional life of the child. Like they attend online class, what's happening with them and the friends, and what is it really happening in the child's life, emotional life. So I think keeping that emotional connection in place so that the child can bring up issues when there is. So this quality time that we often talk about, I think that's very, very important. And I often think that this me time, a lot of times I think that if parents can take care of their own mental health, it serves a lot of purpose for the child. So their distress, their stress, anxiety, and depression oftentimes spills over into the children. So this me time for themselves and for the child. And this is where I talk about this relaxation together, yoga together, or physical exercise together is something that can serve purpose of both enhancing the well-being of the parent and the child. That's what I can think of now.
So last two questions. Are group interventions outside of school more effective for children and adolescents?
Yeah, we did it in a clinical setting, and it was a new experience for me as well. But I found that it was very, very interesting. We conducted it more like a summer camp over a 3 hour, conducted over 3 hours. So we had a warm up and games followed by interventions, and then we made it very creative and innovative for the age group of the child with inputs from Shekhar sir. So I feel that group interventions, be it in a clinic setting or in the school setting, is something that we definitely can deliver as part of service and as part of research as well. I think we need to explore that. It's very time effective, so you can handle quite a group of children within that 1 hour or this few hours, and so it's definitely time effective and cost effective. Secondly, I think when you have this narrow age range, say 9 to 12 or so, I think this peer learning happens very quickly, and so I think it is definitely something that needs to be explored.
Yeah. There's just one, I don't know what we're doing for time, but it says, a child who does not want to open, can you guide us on how to proceed?
Yes.
I think children don't easily open up. Yes, many children don't. One of the ways I find good as icebreakers is you must take the trouble of finding out from the parent what the child is good at, likes, or is fond of, or what makes the child tick. Just about anything. Just have a minute. If there's one question you want to ask before seeing the child, you want to ask the parent, don't ask about anything else about the disorder, but ask what it makes the child tick. What does the child like? What does he love to do? Not very great, he's not excellent in it, but just what does he like to do? And a conversation opener on that count. I have often find that when you talk about something that the child does, which is other than the symptom, the child, I find a sparkle in the child's eye. It is as if, oh, you know me as other than my symptom. You know me as other than the complaint that my parent has told you about. And I feel that's a very significant conversation opener where the child, you connect the child on a different level. Of course, the Gaussian curve I'm talking about, there are extremes. It's very hard to gain the trust of a child. You know, there's a saying that trust saunters in when it comes, but it flees when it goes. So to get trust, you have to spend a lot of time, and with very little things, it will flee. So it's not easy to get onto a child. I agree with you. It's an issue.
So, Soumitra, can we take more questions or?
I think we should all go for dinner.
Yeah.
It's up to all of you. I have no particular preferences.
I think questions are coming up, but they can be answered later on to.
Yes, meaning there are some specific questions like we didn't answer, anybody could answer. is like, what do you do with a child who presents with self-harming behavior in the class? So Dr. Reena Sen had asked that. I felt those are relevant questions for any professionals. So what we would try to do is speak to the panelists and the speakers and maybe create short videos for the ACAM India website and signpost it there, and give some handouts. So that's how we thought we will proceed.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Preeti. Thank you, Dr. Shobha, Professor Shobha, Professor Vivek, Dr. Ram, everybody for a wonderful last session. I think we are almost coming to an end. We have, I will launch a poll, which the participants who are still there, they could answer. Can you see that there is a poll as it come to the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So people are answering. And while they do it, we will keep this for 30 seconds or so. And then I'll request Martin, who is the Martin Pratt, who is the CEO of ACAM UK, to make a few closing remarks.
Hi, Sumitra. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much. First of all, congratulations to the committee and all the speakers for a fantastic inaugural event. Very interesting and really a showcase of what's set to come as we move forward with activities in India. Thank you to all the delegates for taking the time out of your Saturday to come and watch the video and the talks and speakers. And I hope it's been very interesting. And I really hope that going forward, we're able to put on more activities as we go forward with the committee that will appeal to you all in your professional lives. So with that, I say thank you very much to everybody and hope you have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thanks to the viewers and thanks to ACAM and the panelists. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a
Thank you very
lot.
much,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye,
See you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.